I'll start. I'm Yvonne Shea. Sorry. I own my own consulting firm. Prior to that, I was at Netflix in the original films team. I oversaw business and legal affairs for the independent films development slate and also ran business and legal affairs for family films. Prior to that, I was at Disney in Disney branded television, doing both network and studio side deal making in scripted and unscripted programming. I started my entertainment career at Paramount Pictures and international television, and my primary focus has been on above-the-line film and television production deal-making, i.e. rights and writing deals, deals with producers, actors, overalls, directors. I've also done licensing and acquisition of content and hiring production companies to produce original content. I'll now ask Kate O'Connor to please introduce herself and give us a little bit more about her experience.
Hi, I'm Kate O'Connor. I was most recently at Netflix, where I led the legal affairs team for original independent film. Prior to that, I was at Fox in the feature film legal group. And before that, DreamWorks Animation, also in legal affairs. So my areas of specialty are above the line deals for development and production, primarily on the legal affairs side, some business affairs, rights, writing, directors, producers, actor deals.
Thank you.
Hey everyone, my name's Sophia Yen. I am a partner in the entertainment group of a national law firm called Manat, Phelps & Phillips. My specialty is in entertainment transactions and financing. So I do everything from kind of large scale stuff. About 2 weeks ago, I represented a private equity company that purchased the rights to Kiss, the iconic band, their name, image, likeness, and also their whole catalog. And they're going to create an Avatar show out here in Vegas. To smaller deals where I'm representing a lot of, high net worth private investors who are investing in documentaries, indie films, etc., the whole spectrum. So in terms of expertise and what sort of perspective I could provide you on is how the state of financing looks in the content creation world.
Jonathan?
Thank you. My name is Jonathan Handel. I'm an entertainment technology attorney at Feig Finkel, an entertainment boutique in Los Angeles. I also practice independently. In addition, I am a freelance journalist. I wrote for the Hollywood Reporter for 10 years. For Puck for a year, and I'm also a creative writer. I appear in the media quite frequently, and I'm a transactionalist, so I represent producers, writers, some directors, occasionally actors, various other folks. But I also have a separate specialty in entertainment unions and guilds. So I was outside special counsel to SAG-AFTRA for a couple of years. I was in-house at the Writers Guild, and I represent producers, union members. I've represented, as I said, the unions themselves, and I've written 4 books on the guilds, taught for 12 years as an adjunct professor on the guilds as well, and that sort of gives you a sense of it. I guess the other thing I would mention is on the tech side, I was a computer scientist and tech worker prior to law school.
Hi. I'm Rosanna Freed. I'm a partner at DME Law in Los Angeles. It's a boutique law firm, and I currently specialize in representing companies in both the tech and media space, primarily the creator economy space, as it crosses over into both in all forms of monetization. My background is both traditional film and TV and finance, as well as working for startups, creating SVOD, apps, and most recently I was at YouTube original content for 5 years, working with both the original content team, the creator org, YouTube Music, YouTube Shopping, and the like. So I can answer any questions or help with any guidance in the creator economy space and anything that's in the tech media overlay.
Thank you. I think everyone will agree we have a pretty impressive group of panelists here today to answer your questions. I'd love to start off with a question of my own. So there's been a lot going on in our industry. Content spending has been reduced, with film slates being cut and show budgets being cut as well. Paramount Pictures, one of the oldest major studios, is likely to be sold. Not to mention the historic dual strikes by writers and actors last year that the town is still recovering from. Hard to believe that just a few years ago, Netflix was announcing that it was going to premiere a new film every week. And I know Kate can tell you just how much fun that was to be part of making 50 films a year. I don't know how you survived it. Hard to believe, too, that there were 600 scripted shows on air just a little over a year ago in 2022. That number is down to 516 in 2023. That's a staggering 14% drop. By comparison, it was down 7% during the pandemic in 2020. So it would seem that peak TV is really and truly over. The industry was prioritizing growing streaming scale at any cost, and now that focus has shifted to profitability. Imagine that. Speaking of streaming, much has been made of the streaming wars, with the old guard battling it out with the new guard and amongst each other. But was it really a battle between streamers? Or was the fight for eyeballs actually a fight with little companies like Google and social media outlets like TikTok? I'd love it if our panelists could talk more about the interesting times that we live in and how it's affecting each of their practices. Rosanna, I'd love to start with you. So, was it really a battle between Netflix and Disney, between Apple and Warner? Or was it a fight against that little company you used to work for called Google? What roles are YouTube, and social media playing in the evolution of the entertainment and media industry?
Sure. I mean, I think it's no surprise that it is a battle for eyeballs, right? And the generational shift as to where people consume their content. I think that the pandemic and the strikes and everything else that went along with it also added to sort of what's happening in the industry. But when I started sort of in this new digital space, it was when Fox acquired MySpace, if you remember that platform, and sort of didn't know really what to do with it. A lot of these older companies, legacy companies, knew they wanted to be in the space in sort of what they call the short form content space, whatever that meant, because short form content can be 90-second TikToks or it can be 11-minute videos on Quibi, if you remember Quibi. So it really ran the gamut of what was considered short form content. And so we had YouTube come in as a player, right? And I did work for YouTube. As a disclaimer, I did work for YouTube for 5 years. But YouTube, was this platform that anybody could go and create their own content, right? So the barriers to entry were suddenly very low. Anybody who had a phone, and as the phones got better and better and better quality, and the cameras and all the other features, and we know that a lot of people are selling those features here, that anybody from their living room can create. It started creating this entire new industry of what we now call creators. At the time, they were called YouTubers, right? And it was kind of a joke. Cat videos, unboxing videos, like who cares about all of this? So, but they were garnering the billions of eyeballs a day. Okay. If YouTube was a company split on its own away from Google, it would be the absolute biggest media company there is in the world. And that's a fact. Even back then. And so, there were a lot of companies that sort of were like, oh, there are all these creators here. Let's start figuring out a way to aggregate them. And that's where the MCN started coming in. And I did work for an MCN called Fullscreen. And then it was, well, these creators now want to actually cross over to traditional. And what can we do there? And so it really was people that maybe couldn't have made it through the traditional route because there was very high barriers to entry were suddenly going through this route. And then everybody was scrambling to create their own SVOD space, their own subscription service. How many subscriptions can people take? And so again, you start saturating the market and people getting into that space. And it's very interesting because YouTube itself got into the SVOD space and a subscription model, a paywall model, ultimately cannibalizing their own, ad space, which is where that is their cash cow, right? So they were struggling as well in terms of garnering those eyeballs, but then you also have the new generation coming in and how they are used to consuming content. Gen Z is the first generation to consume content through social media, mobile first, and that's how they're used to seeing their content, right? And then it becomes do they prefer short form, very quick, kind of figuring it out, while the bigger players and more traditional players were worried about IP and how to hold on to rights and to split rights and who's going to have what territory. So really, it's not the same business model, but they're working along the same space, and there's so much crossover. And that sort of was always the top dog of which creator is going to cross over to traditional. But now the creators are seeing they're actually making more money on the creator side, the creator economy side, than actually trying to really be that 1% that makes it over to the traditional side. So that's really split the market as well. So, I'm saying a lot of issues that come up, but that's sort of what we're seeing in our space.
Thank you. It's such an interesting space. Can I ask
Yvonne, do you mind if I go next? I
Yeah.
think it kind of jumps on too. So in terms of the financing space, what has really happened is you've seen a lot of disruption from the different technologies, but you still have people who are trying to create this more traditional film and TV and trying to place it in the traditional distribution channels. And it's not working out because they can't monetize that content the way they used to. So I still have a lot of clients who are still doing that, and sometimes they have the wealth to be able to do that, and more power to them. Maybe it premieres at a Sundance or one of these festivals, but it never really goes too much further than that. But I do have clients now who are trying to think of how do I use technology to get to the eyeballs of Gen Z, of where they're living at, to test the IP and use that to kind of be a signal for me of I'm doing all this short form. Is that then going to translate? And then I'll make the larger investment into the film and TV projects to see if that can actually then make the money back.
That's a great
Because for some
point.
people, it has to be a business, right?
Right. Stop to make money.
And that really, you mentioned Sundance and so forth, film festivals. Theatrical box office is down 15-20% from pre-COVID, and there's really no indication that it's ever going to recover to the level that we saw before. Meanwhile, broadcast television and, for that matter, cable television are dead man walking. When you talk to Gen Z, when you talk to the demo that advertisers are interested in, they're watching streaming platforms. And when I started teaching the Entertainment Unions and Guilds course in 2010, residuals depend a lot on what medium something's made for and where it's being reused. And I could say to the students, okay, well, this is broadcast and now it's being reused on basic cable or whatever. Flash forward 10 years later, it's almost impossible to even have that conversation because, people who are 25 years old in law school, they're like, well, what do you mean broadcast? What exactly does that mean? What do you mean cable? I mean, I watch Netflix. I watch Apple. I watch HBO Max. I watch Max. Well, is that cable? Once upon a time it was. Now it's not. So we're in the midst of a transformation that's more dramatic than anything that's happened since post-World War II. 1945 and 46, a third of the country went to the cinema, the movies, every week. Within 5 years, because of the introduction of television and other factors, that plummeted and obviously never recovered to that level. And this new technology of television displaced a lot of traditional cinema. We're seeing that kind of dramatic change now, and there's opportunity in change. There's also a lot of risk. There are a lot of layoffs, all of that. And it is difficult. Financing as Sophia knows directly, is a difficult endeavor. So it's an interesting time, but a very difficult one, I think.
Absolutely. And Kate, you come from both the traditional film world and a streamer. What do you think?
So, like you mentioned earlier, we were Netflix at one point was making 50 films in just the independent film group. So over 100 films, feature films a year, which probably was never sustainable. That has obviously shifted. And in the independent world, Netflix was a big buyer. So you had lots of people being able to count on that revenue stream. That's different now. I think Netflix has said fewer, better. They have had a lot of shifts in the film team. So, we'll see how that goes out. I don't think it will go back anywhere close to what it was. You weren't getting the eyeballs. I think about what happens in my household. My kids are on TikTok and YouTube, and you ask them to watch a movie. They're like, well, that's 2 hours. So we don't see that in the younger generation.
Long form content. What is that?
Well, and I do want to say on like a more positive note too, what I have seen on the financing side is some evolution in some of the traditional financiers, like some banks and lenders in the space. They never knew how they evaluate like AVOD revenue streams and all those, like what's a subscriber worth and all that kind of stuff. They would never lend against it. They would only lend against traditional IP rights. But I've started to see the bankers and whatnot starting to be like, okay, we got to figure out how this revenue stream, we can lend against it, because they're missing out on a big potential. And there are a lot of companies that are doing well in this space, maybe smaller, middle market, whatnot, that could get a bank loan if only the bank could understand how their assets worked.
Thank you. All right. I'd love to turn to questions from the audience. Just a reminder, we have the QR code here for you to submit, or you can go to nablegal.live to submit questions. And I'm going to go to one. I'll start with Wes. A question from Wes. What power, I think this is a good one for Kate. What power do email memos have in an early stage of a project if you're going to contract? If going to contract would mean more involved financial responsibility from both parties, for example, option rights to a novel.
Just an email memo?
Email memo versus going to a long-form contract.
Okay, so I come from a legal affairs background, so especially for rights, I'm going to say you need a contract signed between the two parties to have an effective transfer. An email memo is useful information as to what the parties intended, but please get your rights deal signed.
Protect yourself. Yes. All right. I've got a fun one from Alana, for Sophia. If I could only use a lawyer for one thing when making a movie independently, fully financed, what would you recommend is the most important thing for a producer, for a lawyer to consult on?
Making sure the waterfall makes sense. So the waterfall is like technology, is terminology we use for how is recruitment and who gets what money at what time. And so depending on what sort of project you're working on, studios make it the most confusing thing ever. That's why we have that terminology, studio accounting. But,
that wasn't the nice way of saying it. Right?
And then there's, but even on the indie side, like, where there's not as many parties and it's not supposed to be as complicated, a lot of people don't take the time to understand how the financing is supposed to work. They only care about the creative. And then when it comes time to, if there is money to be distributed, it's not always distributed in accordance to what the deal was supposed to be.
Thank you. I'm going to go to one from Melanie. This one is for Jonathan. What changes are we seeing in negotiations post-strike? I think this would be a great one. I would love it if you talked more about what were the major wins for writers and actors post-strike? What did studios keep? And what do we expect, knowing that the IATSE and Teamster deals are coming up in July?
Sure. So, again, to add the context. So obviously last year we had the directors, writers, and actors negotiations, and the latter two went on strike for a total of over 6 months. This year we have negotiations with IATSE, IATSE, which is the union that represents most of the below-the-line crew, and we have the Teamsters negotiations. To cut to the chase on IATSE for a moment, I am cautiously optimistic that there will not be a strike based on conversations with sources close to the situation. And in fact, Deadline reporting just today, the same thing consistent with that just an hour ago, in fact. So we're hopeful. Now, what were the issues last year? What were the gains? What are the issues this year? The issues last year were streaming residuals, basic wage increases, given that we'd had several years of very high inflation, and AI. Now, the interesting thing about AI was that in September or so of 2022, the Writers Guild board and council candidates issued their candidate statements for an election, and 150 pages of candidate statements. They were talking about how we would have gone on strike 3 years ago if it were not for COVID, that it interrupted the negotiations, a lot of unfinished business, streaming, wage increases, sustainability of careers. How many people mentioned AI? One, and only in passing. But within 2 months, November of 2022, ChatGPT burst into public prominence, and suddenly from the grassroots up, AI became an extremely important issue and a strike-related issue for both of those of the unions that went on strike. Now, what they accomplished, and let's focus on AI, what they accomplished was both strong protections, but with large loopholes. And that sounds kind of contradictory, and to some extent it is. On the writers' side, the writers accomplished, well, first of all, the directors accomplished that AI is not a director. A director has to be a human being, and sort of end of story. It was a very short provision. That probably satisfies what the Directors Guild needed at the time, because if you think about it, a lot of what a director does is on set. And I mean, unless you have a robot with 2 feet that's walking around, it's hard to see how you replace a director as opposed to supplement the director and give the director new tools. So as time goes on, there may be robots but we're not there yet. So move on to the writers. The writers, achieved a provision that writing is done by humans, not by bots. And what that means is that if a bot creates a story or creates a script that the studio provides to the writer gets paid as though that the minimums that apply are as though that's what the writer is doing is an original script. In other words, the material that's supplied is not considered a rewrite or source material that would lower the scale. However, most writers, in film especially, most writers are paid overscale. The Writers Guild agreement sets minimums. It doesn't set overscale. That's what's negotiated by the agent and the entertainment attorney. In a situation, okay.
But I was just going to say, one thing that I've started seeing in the WGA, like deal making, is they got to win for theatrical, where if you're acquiring a script and it's not 200% above what the minimum is, then you have to add an additional step to it, which then trigger benefit payments, and so it can really increase the cost of the budget. But what I've started to see is people take the position of how many of these films are really going theatrical. So we should really be looking at what the new media provisions are. And new media, if you have a budget under $3 million, you can negotiate whatever you want in terms of acquisition pricing.
That's right. I mean, again, this blurring of what medium is something made for and what are people doing, and the shift from theatrical to streaming motion pictures is very significant. But back on the AI side, even in theatrical, what could happen is, say I'm a writer, I typically get $400,000 for an original script, and the studio supplies me with a bot script to rewrite. And I say, okay, $400K, and my agent says that, and the studio says, no, $300K. Well, he gets $400 usually. Well, yeah, but that's when he starts from a blank page. Now he's starting from what the bot did. The Writers Guild agreement does not in any way address that, because that's overscale. That's the individual negotiation. The other thing is, think about quality of life. So, in the one scenario, non-AI, the studio exec, the creative exec says to me, want you to write an action adventure involving gay rights on Mars and a civil war. And it's got to be, with a strong male lead and a this and a that, and the governor is female, and go for it. Well, now I have a great creative, landscape to play with. And that brings me as a writer great satisfaction, because it's not just about the money, it's about the career satisfaction. Versus the AI scenario, they hand me a script that the bot has written and say, rewrite this. Like, what am I, Google's pitch? I mean, am I, pardon my language, but,
You meant pitch, right?
Pitch.
Yeah.
That was
Google
the pitch. Google's pitch.
Thank you, Sophia.
But the point is, what's the quality of your work life if you become a rewriter for bots rather than an original screenwriter? And so those are the loopholes and the gains that the Writers Guild made. On the acting side, very briefly, consent and compensation, when digital avatars of an existing actor are used, or even attributes, eyes, nose, mouth, or ears. However, if the studio wants to use a completely synthetic avatar, they can do that. They have to notify the guild, but they don't need permission, and they don't have to pay for the fact that they trained on all sorts of existing material. Now, this is a situation where the technology is becoming more and more powerful with each passing minute if we walk the floor of this convention and this conference. And that creates great stresses and great difficulties. Negotiations will start again late next year, okay, in advance of the 2026 contract expiration. So this is going to be a continuing cycle. And in fact, even now, the Screen Actors Guild, SAG-AFTRA, has a strike authorization out against the video game industry. Those negotiations are kind of piddling along. They've also they just did their sound recording contract. They got AI provisions. The Musicians Union got AI provisions, and SAG-AFTRA is going to be negotiating its late night and soap opera deal, and AI will be an issue there too.
Actually, John Beckett.
And just to close, what we are hoping with the IA is that the studios have learned that if you get the CEOs involved and have people who can say yes, that we don't need a strike.
And actually, if I could throw it to Kate, because we were just talking about how AI comes up in actor negotiation. How are you seeing that? Are you able to say, well, look, rely on what your union negotiated?
So we are seeing that. I am seeing that in my consulting practice now. Actors want contractual protections. The SAG negotiations were very long and detailed, and there was some progress made, I think, but I don't think there was consensus among the members as to whether that was protective enough. So we're seeing actors asking for contract belt and suspenders. They want it to be clear in their contracts that consent is required. Some of the higher paid actors don't care as much about the compensation so much as don't use AI without my permission. I want to know what you're doing in advance.
Great point. And actually, speaking of AI, I know people have questions about AI. If we could take it just back to something very foundational from Alice here, I have heard that if you create something with AI, it is not copyrightable. Is that true? And to what extent can you use AI to start and then change it so that it would be copyrightable?
Do you want to address that? Or I can address that. So the question was whether AI generated material is subject to copyright. The answer is if there is no real human intervention, then the Copyright Office and the courts have taken the position that no, it is not copyrightable, not registrable. However, if you take what the AI generated and then edit and modify and intervene with it, such that there's human creativity or human involvement, then that is subject to copyright.
Second layer there, which is the AI is being trained on copyrighted material, And it's hard to decipher with the current technology, as far as I know, what's what. So everything is sort of, it's hard to decipher where it's coming from. And I've actually read an article that I guess AI has found the end of the internet, that they do need to actually now create new content for the AI to train itself on creating content. So it's so many layers to it, right? That is it's all being it's all in one pot together. So it's hard to say, to answer that question directly without knowing specifically what you're talking about, which particular content.
So true. Good point. All right. Question from Paul. With doing away with salary quotes, how do you know how to benchmark an initial offer?
You go first.
Depends on how you want to approach it. You could lowball, offer a minimum, and see what someone comes back with. In reality, there is a lot of information already floating around in people's heads generally about what a certain job is worth, what a certain piece of talent would command. But you can't ask for that information.
I would just generally say if you're the one making the initial offer, start lower, because no matter what, the agent always thinks you started lower and they're going to ask for more, right? And it's so annoying because I have clients who are trying to be fair and then you're like, oh, we're going to be the rational and we're just going to cut through the negotiations and give them what we want to give them. And then 4 months later, you're still like passives and derivatives. You're like, we don't even know if this is going to get made. And they're talking about subsequent productions and what their passive is going to look like. Anyway, so going back to the original question, there are some rules of thumb. So if you're looking at riders and like a rider, sometimes people say it's roughly between 2 and 2.5% of your budget, and underlying rights acquisition around that too. But then things can get skewed. If someone's more talented, you can use like WGA as a certain scale. Directors, would you say that's like about 5%-ish or?
Depending on the budget,
yeah,
right?
depending on the budget, yeah.
Lower budget independent film,
yeah.
Probably. Higher budget, you definitely don't want it, right? You do not want to be,
exactly. And then
$160 million film, you don't want to pay.
And you don't have $1 million.
And they use the floors and the ceilings there too. So then you could say floors at a minimum, you'll get that. And the ceiling is like, hey, you'll get up to this, but then, and you do the math and you're like, okay, that adds up to about $10 million budget or something like that. So that's ways that we try to reasonably approach it, but there's a lot of human components that really mess up and lengthen those negotiations.
And I do think quotes are all over the place depending on the content, because again, content means a lot of different things right now. So if you have a brand paying for content, they're going to pay a lot more, and the influencer or creator or whomever that person is commanding different budgets for different things. Maybe it's one to star in it, it's another one to promote it, where on the traditional side, all of those things are included in a quote, where on my side of the business with the creator economy, all of that is bifurcated. And when you're getting, 7 figures to put something up on, a couple Instagram stories, and then in a traditional side, you're saying, hey, actually it's an all-in fee and you're going to promote it and do all the marketing and use your socials and go out there in person. It's a harder quote to manage. So it really, again, depends on who you're working with.
And there's going to be market
7 figures for an Instagram post.
Sure. Yes.
And the wrong business.
The ad dollars, it's all about the eyeballs. Where are the ad dollars going? And so if you have a big following that is converting, it's not just about subscription and how many people are actually following you. There's actual, conversion. There are many creators out there with just a couple 100,000 followers, but they're converting all of their followers into affiliate deals, making hundreds of thousands of dollars a month, where there are people have millions of followers and cannot convert one, item that they're trying to, like maybe it's a high-end shoe or something like that. That's a whole nother space to talk about. So there's a lot that goes into the data as well.
And do you guys expect to see some market correction here? Because a lot of these quotes from before were places like Netflix problem. No, just kidding. No, it was though.
I'm not taking personal responsibility.
Yeah, no. But you guys were paying a lot more, and also because you were buying out, and then so people were establishing the quote. But what I'm seeing also is because streamers are buying less, there's less work to go around too. So I'm thinking there's going to be a market adjustment, but I haven't seen the agents acting like that yet.
Do we really think an agent would proactively take less?
I don't know. I'm curious. What do you guys think?
There obviously needs to be a market correction, and I think there will be, but as long as there's other things happening out there with the brand deals and with the sort of, big players out there, and especially in this big tech space, still paying that kind of money, I don't think the correction is there just yet, but it will happen because there's just going to be less content created, right? So everyone's going to have to share in this smaller pot. Right.
And it ultimately requires more innovation in putting together financing, putting together a package that is bankable.
Yeah. And all those budgets are going down, even though costs are increasing because they can't find a matching sale on the other side to pay for it. So if it's going to cost you $10 million, the most you can sell for is $5 million. Where's the wisdom of making that, right? Yeah.
I will say though, I think it's also a matter of leverage, right? If you have the leverage, if you're a big name star, you're always going to be able to command top dollar. All right. Just a reminder, again, we've got about 20 minutes left. If you have any questions you'd love to submit, please, nablegal.live. All right. So I have a question from Bill, who says, I'm a producer. I share the copyright for an original script with 2 co-writers. All 3 are listed on the U.S. copyright registration. It's not registered with the WGA. Can I develop the script without one co-writer who has become dead weight? What kind of financial obligations do we have to this writer? It's an indie film. I'm going to talk sort of broadly, perhaps about this kind of, I'm sorry. Did I not? Okay. Once again, from Bill, I'm a producer. I share the copyright for an original script with 2 co-writers. All 3 are listed on the U.S. copyright registration. It's not WGA registered. Can I develop this script without one co-writer who became no longer desirable? What financial obligation do we have to this writer once the project goes?
Well, the issue is whether there's a written agreement between the producer and the writers and what that agreement specifies. The person described, Phil, I think, describes himself as a producer, but it's not clear whether he's also a co-writer. He says he shares the copyright with 2 co-writers, but how he got the copyright, whether in fact he truly has an interest in the copyright or not, depends on whether there was a written agreement or not. So the question can't be answered directly except to say that there needs to be, when you get in a situation like this, you need a written agreement. If you're a producer, to create an extreme example, suppose you pay a writer to do writing, but you don't have any written agreement. You just have some emails saying, I'd like you to write a script about X, and I'll pay you such and such an amount, and they do that. You actually don't own the copyright, even though you paid the writer. Copyright does not transfer without either an actual employment relationship, which is not likely to exist in this situation, or a written assignment. There needs to be a written agreement. So it's a very good example of why, as you start to get involved in a project, that you need to have an entertainment lawyer. And we could have a whole conversation about how do you know when you need a lawyer, because, you start talking at a party and you say, I have this idea. I'm not a writer. I'm a producer. I'm a writer. Well, that's an interesting, that touches me. And then you go and you do some emails back and forth, and then you start developing something that's sort of a treatment and an action. At what point do you need a written agreement for each party to protect themselves? It's a slippery slope, and it can be very difficult. But in this situation, if there isn't a written agreement, there's no clear answer to this without analyzing it.
And I think that's a good segue to a question we have from Rob, who's asking, when do I need to have legal representation? He's saying he's a writer in his first year with an agent doing general meetings and submitting scripts. At what point do you need to sign on with an attorney? Kate?
I would sign on with an attorney before anything is sold, maybe even before you directly pitch. If there's going to be an offer made to buy a script, it sounds like these are scripts that have already been written, a spec script. I would hire an attorney to get involved in the negotiation before selling that. You could hire somebody to look over your paper once it's done, but it would be wise to have somebody knowledgeable in the space ahead of making a deal.
Yeah, I mean, it's very similar. When I worked on the traditional side and we worked at a studio and these things came to our desk, it's sort of like building a house without having the foundation and the rights to it. And you spend millions of dollars building that house and the foundation is not there and it's not correct, or it's not, you don't have the right zoning, or whatever it may be. The script is the same thing. It's a chain of title. And, when we got these complicated things in front of our desk, it was almost like from a buyer's perspective, especially in a very, in a sort of world that we live in now where, there is a limited market. You want to make sure you have a clear chain of title to sell. Because if you don't have that, no one's going to step into that, because it is very messy to try to figure out who owns what. So having a lawyer from the onset is much more important, I think, than having an agent or a manager from the onset, to be honest. And I am biased saying that, but I really do think that is important. And a right situation is very important.
But what the counterpoint that makes it difficult is, if you're an independent producer and you're paying for lawyers out of pocket, and you're a writer who doesn't have a ton of money and you're paying for lawyers out of pocket, at what point is the conversation serious enough that it's worth having, paying for a legal counsel? And that's the countervailing factor that makes this so difficult. If we could turn on the tap and get, legal advice for free, it'd be a different world, obviously. And we wouldn't be sitting here, exactly. And we wouldn't be sitting here. But, that's the difficulty, of course, is that there are a lot of conversations that don't turn into projects, ultimately. And at what point do you bring in lawyers?
And I would say the other thing is a lot of writers counsel, they work as a percentage. So they usually 5% of whatever you make. And then sometimes the hard thing is even finding an attorney who will take you on, because it's like, okay, how much are you making? If they're only getting 5% of that, it may not necessarily be worth their time. So then you might have to settle for a lawyer who's kind of more starting out and trying to build with you too and scale with you. But then that also affects the legal representation you're getting, because they probably are learning with you.
Right. Plus, that's not an option on the producer side.
Great points. All right. We've just got a few minutes left. I have a question from Alana. Would you recommend that a content creator create an LLC from a channel's initial creation or after hitting a certain monetary benchmark? I think that's for Rosanna.
I would say that's more of a corporate question, but I would think in a tax question, really. There's always a benefit to having your own company and to protect yourself and, to sort of separate from any kind of personal liability. So I'd say yes, and it's not very expensive. So and it's something you can actually do yourself on, any website, any Secretary of State. So I would say yes, that's slam dunk there.
I wouldn't recommend, I would supplement that there are costs involved, and I wouldn't recommend, doing it oneself, honestly. I've had any number of clients come to me and, I set it up, I set up a Delaware LLC because I heard Delaware is the place to be. Well, now you've increased your costs and you actually haven't gained anything from it.
Well, yes.
It becomes the same. It's similar to the question we just talked about, when you bring in a lawyer, which is, if you're making $100,000 a year as an influencer, is it really worth the money to set up an LLC? If you're making 500, yeah. If you're making 80 or 100, it becomes a harder conversation once you deduct your expenses and your living expenses and your rent that 100,000 is not.
Sure.
Paying $5,000-$10,000 to a lawyer is uncomfortable.
Right. And a lot of it is for tax reasons, right? It's the same reason why actors have their own corporations, their own loan outs. It's all for tax purposes. So it is a very individual decision, but it typically, most people do that. Most people create their own company.
And you mentioned the tax issue, right? We would see a lot of LLCs where someone had an elected corporate tax treatment. That's a question to talk to an accountant about ahead of time, because LLCs can have pass-through you get taxed like an individual if you don't elect to be treated like a corporation. So just something to talk to a tax professional about ahead of setting something up.
And you can ask, it's S Corp, so you can just be like, hey, I heard I might want to elect for this S Corp and blah, blah, blah. And then hopefully they will advise you properly.
Right. An S Corp is a small corporation with fewer than 75 shareholders, and that's what is used as a loan out a lot by talent.
All right. I think this has got to be our final question. I'm sorry. From Rob. Is there any instance where a client's agent and manager were ready to sign off on a project, but you as an attorney just felt that they should hold on the project?
Well, I guess the way I'd answer that is that, entertainment attorneys versus agents and managers have overlapping competence and responsibilities. And, there can be, the major deal points might be right, but there may be some subsidiary points that potentially, just as I was talking about in the context of guilds, that potentially one could drive a truck through. And as the lawyer, you have to be able to stand up to the agent and explain in a way that's to the agent and the client and the manager, if any, in a way that is clear and compelling and not overly legalistic. Look, here's how screwed my client could be if we don't hold firm on this. So it's not so much that the lawyer is going to say, well, this is a bad project, you shouldn't be in business with XYZ or whatever. It's that, how do you avoid getting the other side separating the lawyer from the client and treating the lawyer as just an annoyance?
Right. And it's also sort of, you talked about the money, you've talked about sort of, the project, but when you actually get the contract and you see that there may be exclusivity provisions, and for example, in my world, for certain categories of products or brands or things, and then suddenly you have, but I have all these very lucrative brand deals, or I'm trying to start my own line of blank, or I'm trying to do this on my own YouTube channel. That all conflicts with maybe the deal that's been presented that has the details that wasn't maybe brought up at the agent stage. So it's not so much that the lawyer is saying no, it's like, hey, flagging all these other things that will actually sort of take away from maybe other business that you're interested in. And, it may cut you off from a year, 2 years of that particular category because you're exclusive in this area. So those are the things that I think end up mucking up deals, less so the lawyers saying, I don't like this.
You could have situations where the long form does not actually track the deal as agreed. And there you've got to stand up as well.
And chain of title. I think that complicates things a lot. Once you make a deal, everybody's happy. Then you start looking at where the rights are coming from and whether they're buttoned up or not. And there's frequently questions around that you want to resolve before you proceed with buying a project.
Make sure you have the rights. Yeah. All right. Thank you to the audience for some amazing questions, and thank you to our wonderful panelists for all of their sage advice.